The wind over the dry plains carried dust and silence across miles of open land. Thomas, a quiet cowboy in his mid-30s, had spent most of his life working alone on his small ranch. He wasn't a man of many words, but he had the habit of rising before dawn and resting only after every tool was in its place and every animal fed. Life was simple, but it was heavy with loneliness. The ranch stretched wide, but no laughter filled the air. No footsteps echoed beside his boots. That spring, Thomas read a notice in the nearby town. It said a group of Chinese immigrants were looking for honest work and a place to stay. They had arrived with little more than a few small bags and eyes full of fear from the journey. Among them was a woman named Li Mei. She spoke softly, always keeping her gaze low. Her hands were thin but strong, marked with small cuts from long labor. The townsfolk didn't talk kindly of her people. They said she'd never fit in, that she was too strange and quiet. But Thomas didn't listen. He only saw a person who worked hard and spoke with calm kindness. When he offered her work on his ranch, helping in the kitchen and garden, she bowed deeply, whispering, "Thank you," in broken English. She didn't smile often, but when she did, it softened the entire room. The first weeks passed in silence between them. He would work outside fixing fences or training horses while she cooked or cleaned inside. In the evenings, they would share a quiet meal. She would eat slowly, careful with every movement, and sometimes hum a tune that reminded him of rain. One evening, a storm rolled in from the mountains. The wind tore through the ranch house roof, shaking the wooden boards. Thomas hurried to cover the windows while Li Mei lit lanterns inside. Lightning flashed bright across the plains, and for the first time she reached out and held his arm. Frightened, trembling. "It's only thunder," he said softly, but her fear was real. He could feel it through her shaking hands. She whispered something in Chinese, a prayer maybe. That night they sat by the fireplace, neither speaking, both listening to the storm's growl. It was the first time he saw the depth in her eyes, a pain that seemed older than she was. Days became weeks, and life on the ranch began to find rhythm again. Li Mei was gentle with the animals and had a way of making the old house feel warm again. She mended curtains, planted flowers near the porch, and even sang when she thought no one was near. Thomas would sometimes stop in the middle of his chores just to listen. Still, he noticed she often woke in the night, sitting by the window as if waiting for someone who never came. One morning, while they were working in the barn, he saw a long scar on her shoulder where her dress had slipped slightly. She froze when she noticed his eyes, pulling the fabric up fast and turning away. He didn't ask, though the question burned in him. Later that day, when the sun was low, he quietly said, "You don't have to hide things here." She looked at him, unsure of what he meant, then shook her head. "Some pain better stay quiet," she whispered. That evening, Thomas sat outside with his coffee, thinking about what she said. He had his own quiet pain. His parents gone too early. His brother lost in a cattle drive accident years ago. Maybe that was why he didn't press her with questions. Maybe they both understood that some people carried invisible scars. Months passed. Neighbors began whispering about how close they seemed. Some said it wasn't right for a cowboy to have a Chinese woman under his roof. But Thomas didn't care. He knew how hard she worked, how she had made the house feel alive again. When one of the neighbors made a cruel joke in the saloon, Thomas stood up and walked away. He didn't raise his voice, but everyone knew that meant more than any words. One afternoon, Li Mei came to him as he was feeding the horses. She looked nervous, holding her hands together. "You kind man," she said carefully. "You good to me." Then she added, "People in town say I must leave soon. They not like me here." Thomas wiped his hands on his sleeve, confused. "Who said that?" She didn't answer, only looked down. That night he couldn't sleep. The next morning he rode into town. He found the man who had been spreading rumors, a trader who'd refused to pay Li Mei for sewing work weeks before. Thomas didn't fight him. He only said, "You talk again, I'll take your name to the sheriff." The man looked away, muttering. When Thomas returned to the ranch, Li Mei was waiting near the porch. Her eyes glistened as if she already knew. "You defend me," she said softly. "Why?" He simply said, "Because no one should be alone in this world." That was the day something changed between them. She began to talk more, about her village far away, about how she lost her family in floods and had come across the ocean hoping for a new beginning. She told him she once trusted a man who brought her west, but left her without money or protection. Thomas listened without interruption, every word heavy in the quiet air. When she finished, he said, "You're safe now." Over time, the talk of marriage came not from him, but from her. She wanted a name in this land, a home, something stable. For Thomas, it wasn't romance in the way the town imagined. It was something deeper. Two people who had been broken finding strength beside each other. He married her quietly under the open sky with only a preacher and two witnesses. She wore a simple white shawl she had made herself, and when he slipped the small ring on her finger, her hands trembled. That night, she stood on the porch looking out toward the dark plains. "I thought I would never be free again," she said quietly. He joined her, the stars wide above them. "You are," he replied. "You're free now, Li Mei." She didn't answer, but her small smile said everything. In the months after, the ranch changed. She kept chickens, tended a new vegetable patch, and even started teaching some children from nearby farms simple Chinese words. The laughter of kids filled the air again, and Thomas began to smile more often. Still, sometimes he would catch her staring at the horizon, as if the past still called her name. One evening, she told him there were things she could never forget. The people she lost, the fear she carried when she arrived in this country. Thomas didn't try to fix it. He just said, "You don't have to forget. You just have to live." That night, when the wind rose across the plains again, she didn't tremble like before. She lit a lantern, and they sat together in silence the same way they had months ago during that first storm. Only now, it wasn't fear that filled the air. It was something like peace, and though Thomas never said it out loud, he knew he had found something rare. Not love that begins with fire, but love that begins with healing. And for Li Mei, who had crossed oceans and carried scars both seen and unseen, that was enough to begin again. Months passed after their quiet wedding, and life on the ranch took on a new rhythm. The mornings began with Li Mei stepping out before sunrise, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, walking to the chicken coop while Thomas filled the horses' troughs. They worked side by side without many words, but there was a peace between them that neither had known before. The ranch that once echoed only with wind and creaking boards now carried the soft sounds of laughter, broom strokes, and gentle talk. The town still whispered about them. Some people said a cowboy had no business marrying a foreign woman. Others said he had lost his mind. But Thomas paid them no mind. He had long learned that silence spoke louder than argument. He worked hard, paid his debts, and treated everyone with quiet respect. Over time, people began to see that the woman they had judged too quickly was the reason his land had started to bloom again. Li Mei brought a touch of patience that no one else could. She tended to the sick animals with herbs she grew herself, and helped a neighbor's wife during childbirth when no doctor could reach in time. When the woman lived and gave birth safely, the rumor about the strange woman started to change. People began to come to the ranch, not out of gossip but for advice. Li Mei never turned anyone away. She didn't talk much, but her kindness spoke for her. Thomas noticed that the weight on her shoulders had started to lift. She smiled more now, and sometimes when he came back from long rides, he found her humming songs from her homeland while kneading dough. Still, there were nights when she woke from bad dreams sitting up in bed with her hands clutching the blanket. When he asked if she was all right, she always said the same thing. Just dream, only dream. One day, while repairing the barn roof, Thomas saw a group of travelers approach. They were Chinese men dressed in dusty work clothes. When they saw Li Mei, they spoke quickly in their language. Thomas didn't understand, but he saw the worry on her face. Later that evening, she told him one of them had been her cousin. He was traveling west for railroad work and had brought news of others from her village. Most had not survived the long journey or the hard labor. Her eyes glistened, but she did not cry. Instead, she said, "I want to help others like me, lost people." That simple wish planted something in both their hearts. Together, they started to open the ranch gates to travelers who had nowhere to stay. Many were workers, some Chinese, some Mexican, some native, men who had been hurt or cheated on the road. Li Mei would feed them soup and bread. Thomas would give them a place to sleep in the barn. At first, the townsfolk frowned on it, but soon even they began to send those in need toward the ranch, saying, "The cowboy and his wife will help." Life grew busy, and the little home became a refuge for the forgotten. Thomas built extra bunks in the barn, and Li Mei turned old cloth into quilts. Some people stayed for a night, others for months. There were stories shared around the fire, stories of loss, escape, and hope. Thomas didn't understand every word when Li Mei spoke to the travelers in her native tongue, but he saw the light in her eyes. She was no longer the frightened woman who had once trembled at thunder. She had become a calm center in a stormed world. One winter evening, snow began to fall heavy and cold. A rider arrived at their door carrying a small boy wrapped in rags. The man said nothing, only pointed to the child and whispered that he had no family left. Then he rode away into the snow. Limi took the boy inside without hesitation. She cleaned his wounds, fed him warm broth, and sat beside him all night. When the boy opened his eyes in the morning, he looked up at her and whispered, "Mama." From that day, their home changed again. The boy, whose name was Daniel, stayed. He followed Thomas everywhere, learning to feed the horses, mend fences, and ride. At night, Lime taught him small words in her language. Thank you, good, and home. They became a small family, bound not by blood but by something stronger. Years moved like wind across the plains. The boy grew taller, stronger, and braver. Thomas's hair turned gray and the lines on his face deepened, but his eyes remained calm. The ranch became known as a safe place. People said, if you're lost, go where the red lantern glows. That lantern was Lime's doing. She hung it on the porch every night as a sign that kindness still lived there. But not everything was peaceful. One spring, a sickness spread through the nearby valley. Many families fell ill. Thomas wanted to keep Lime and Daniel safe, but she insisted on helping. She went house to house carrying water, making medicine from her herbs, and feeding the weak. People feared she would fall sick too, but she didn't stop. Thomas would watch her from a distance, praying under his breath. When she came home one evening exhausted and pale, he made her sit by the fire. She said quietly, "This is how I pay for the life I got back." By summer, the sickness had passed. Many who survived said it was because of her. The townsfolk gathered one evening to thank her and Thomas. They brought food, quilts, and gifts. For the first time, the woman they once whispered about stood before them as someone deeply respected. She didn't speak much that night, only said, "No one lives alone in this world." Years later, Daniel grew into a man. He took over most of the ranch work while Thomas's strength began to fade. One day, Daniel asked how his parents had met. Thomas told him the story, about the storm, the fear, the silence that became friendship. Daniel listened quietly, then said, "You taught me that family isn't something you're born with. It's something you build." When Thomas passed peacefully one autumn morning, Lime buried him under the large cottonwood tree near the ranch gate, the same place where he had once told her she was safe. She sat there for a long time, holding his hat in her lap. She didn't cry. Instead, she whispered softly, "You gave me peace." After his death, she continued to live on the ranch with Daniel and his new wife. She grew older, her hair silver like frost, but she still tended her garden and lit the red lantern every evening. Travelers who passed by would still stop, asking for food or shelter, and she always welcomed them with a smile. One cold night, after many years, Daniel found her sitting by the window, her hands folded. She looked out at the stars and said, "When I came to this land, I thought I had lost everything, but he gave me back my life." She passed away that night, peaceful and still, with the red lantern glowing beside her. The next morning, Daniel hung the same lantern on the porch again, and every year after, he kept that tradition alive. Travelers still spoke of the ranch with the red light of kindness, where a cowboy and a foreign woman had turned loneliness into love, pain into peace, and a small ranch into a place where no one would ever be turned away again. Their story became something people told their children, not as a tale of romance, but as a lesson of compassion. It reminded everyone that kindness can grow in the harshest lands and that sometimes the strongest hearts come from the deepest wounds. And somewhere in that endless stretch of western plain, the wind still carried the faint sound of Lime's humming, soft, steady, and free.